Esther Frink paused suddenly at the edge of the clearing, where she was gathering kindling that early winter evening in 1817, as she heard the sound of her name being called. The sobbing, agonizing cry floated from the throat of the wind through the deep woods. Esther stood terror-stricken. The forest lay deep with the shadows of night, and behind her, the tag end of the moon outlined her parents' cabin and outbuildings. "Esther, Esther!" The low cry came again. The young woman shivered. She suddenly screamed and ran toward home. She flung the kitchen door open and collapsed in a heap before the feet of her startled mother. When she regained consciousness, her father, Esther Frink, was bathing her forehead with a rag wrung out in cold water and vinegar. As Esther became more coherent, she explained that she had become frightened by hearing her name called. Mrs. Frink chided her and said it was only the wind cutting up didos in the woods. The Frink family was one of the earliest to settle on the site of the hamlet of Bailey's Corners, as Brookfield was known then. One Saturday, Esther's cousin, Thomas York, rode over to spend the night with her brothers. Esther had almost forgotten the voice she heard. She was fond of her cousin, for he never teased her about being an old maid of 24, and he always allowed her to ride his horse. Esther expressed a desire to attend the Methodist services that were going to be held Sunday in the schoolhouse in the Waterman district. She had traveled the road many times across the hills from Beaver Creek. York loaned his horse and buckled on Esther's side saddle. With his help, Esther mounted and rode off through the woods road, humming her favorite song, "On Jordan's Stony Banks I Stand." She rode slowly along the road, enjoying the frosty morning. About an hour later, she clattered across the plank bridge that spanned the creek south through the Gates neighborhood. As she reached the corner of Gideon Kenyon's place, she turned her mount westward on the road leading down by Daniel White's mill near the Waterman schoolhouse. As she neared the mill, she heard the cloppity-clop of hooves on the road. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw that it was Dudley Hall with his horse and cutter. Hall resided in a former schoolhouse near the Corners. As he drew alongside of Esther, he raised his whip arm in a cheerful salute. Without warning, Esther's horse reared, whinnying in terror. The young woman was thrown backwards out of the saddle, but her left foot twisted in the stirrup and would not pull free. The horse bolted through the snow-covered brush, dragging its rider. Esther's body was tossed about like a doll against the tree stumps and logs in the new clearing near the mill. The horse regained the road but, instead of crossing the bridge, plunged into the icy stream. As soon as the horse bolted, Dudley Hall summoned help from the schoolhouse. 2 men left the services and drove rapidly in Hall's cutter after the fleeing horse. They soon came upon the horse in the stream. Carefully, they lifted Esther and pulled her twisted foot free of the stirrup. She was carried to the bank. There was a faint pulsation of her heart, and then it was gone. The wind sighed through the trees, and the men could hear distinctly the name, Esther. The voice in the wind had called, and the young woman's spirit had answered. Esther's funeral was held 2 days later. She was buried in the field within sight of the Frink home. The Reverend Charles Giles, pastor of the Methodist Church, wrote an elegy on Esther Frink's death. It contained 20 stanzas, but only a few have survived the bridge of 200+ years. Say, Esther, what was that sweet voice that called you so friendly by name? Oh, did your blessed spirit rejoice when this kindly messenger came? What mournful, deep groans were those heard that haunted the gloom of the night? A warning that truly appeared foreboding some awful affright. The inscription on Esther's gravestone reads as follows: "Why should we mourn departing friends, or shake at death's alarm? 'Tis but the voice of Jesus sends to call us to his arms." From History of the Waterman School District, Its Schools and Its Peoples, by Reverend Albert York, 1892. Miss Esther Frink, March 15, 1817. Although the subject of this memorial record was not a resident there, yet because the scene of her tragic death was laid in the Waterman School District, it firstly finds a place in these notices commemorating her death. Mr. Asa Frink, the father of Esther, was among the early settlers of the town, and for many years resided in the old Frink homestead, later occupied by George Rabbock. At the time when called so unexpectedly to meet an untimely fate, Esther was a young lady of about 24 years of age, before whom life was opening full of promise. Thomas York, Jr., a cousin of hers, had spent the previous night at the home, and on the following day, Sunday, Esther then expressed a desire to attend the religious services at the Waterman schoolhouse, and the horse he had ridden there was put at her service. This, with a side saddle, afforded the ordinary conveniences for such excursions in those days. There being no road on the west side of the creek, the bridge was crossed to the road leading from the village south through the Gates neighborhood to the corner west of M. Sideon Kenyon's, Peleg Stambras, whence the road led down by White's Mill to the schoolhouse. Turning the corner west from Mr. Kenyon's, and when a part of the way to the mill, she was overtaken by Mr. Dudley Hall, then living in the now abandoned schoolhouse near the corner, who, in passing her in a cutter, frightened the horse she was riding, and falling from the saddle, her foot caught firmly in the stamp, in which condition she was dragged helplessly through the brush and among the stumps and logs of the new clearing between the piece of falling and the mill. The horse continued its fearful flight till crossing the bridge with its unconscious burden, and from the west side it suddenly turned and plunged into the water, stopping just below the bridge about midway in the stream. Although when rescued, faint pulsations of life were perceptible, the unfortunate girl, leaving her home in the blush of health, soon expired. She was very religious, a member much beloved of the Methodist Church, to the services of which she was on her way, when so unexpectedly she was called to her long home. For some time previously she had been in the employ of Mr. Henry Hinckley of Leonardsville. One night about 3 weeks before the sad occurrence, as she informed her friends soon after, when she had retired, she heard a voice distinctly saving Esther, to which she replied. It was the belief, current at the time, that this was understood by her as a token of some impending disaster. On Sunday morning, before leaving for the services at the schoolhouse, she sang with much earnestness and feeling the hymn commencing, "On Jordan's stormy banks I stand." An elegy on her death was written by Reverend Charles Giles, then a minister of local repute in the Methodist Church. This was a manuscript containing 20 stanzas, in the possession of Mrs. Freela of York, as late as 1840, and was republished in the Brookfield Courier, December 27, 1876. One of the stanzas was as follows. "Say, Esther, what was that sweet voice that called you so friendly by name? Oh, did your blessed spirit rejoice when kindly this messenger came? What mournful, deep groans more those heard, that haunted the gloom of the night? A warning that truly appeared, foreboding some awful affright. A few days before her death she heard an uncommon voice call her by name, which she received as a warning that her end was near. The night before her death a pious family who lived nearby was alarmed by an unaccountable noise of distress which was repeated a number of times.